everyone. Thank you for joining the fifth webinar of Gender Center for the Global South this afternoon. Today we are pleased to welcome Dr. Philani Mthembu, our very special guest speaker from South Africa. I will start by introducing Dr. Philani. Dr. Philani is the Executive Director of the Institute for Global Dialogue in South Africa. Dr. Philani holds a PhD degree in political science from a joint doctoral program at the Graduate School of Global Politics of High Universität Berlin in Germany and the School of International Studies at Renmin University, Beijing, China. He co-founded the Berlin Forum on Global Politics, a non-profit organization dedicated to the promotion of academic expert and public understanding of global politics. He has many publications. His very recent publication includes a single-authored book titled "China and India's Development Cooperation in Africa: The Rise of Southern Powers." His main area of interest is geopolitics, global South studies, international development cooperation, and of course, South-South cooperation in that. So today he will be sharing with us his expert opinion on a very important global concern, the international development cooperation challenges post-COVID-19 and the role of the emerging Southern power, and I believe he's going to give us some insights on the role of India as well. With that, I ask that you all give your full attention to our very special guest, Dr. Philani Mthembu. And now I am giving you the talk, Dr. Philani, for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, colleagues. It's an honor to have the opportunity to, I think, just to present a few ideas that are emerging as we see what is happening in the world. I think it's important just to state that what I'll be discussing, a lot of it, or part of it, stems from recent research. So around for instance, China and India's development cooperation in Africa and the rise of Southern powers. But it also stems from recent work on which led to a book titled Africa and the World, in a changing geopolitical landscape. So some of the ideas come from there, but also what we are seeing is that some of the research that was in the findings that came out there are actually being accelerated by the crisis that we are seeing with COVID-19. So the title of my presentation, it is Navigating a Post-COVID-19 Development Landscape. What role for Southern powers? And before I go into it, let me just first read an extract from the book, a very short extract, and then I'll inform you how I'll be structuring the presentation. So what I'll just read is just about the very concept of Southern powers. It says, the very notion of Southern powers draws from work on emerging powers, a concept presupposing a number of characteristics shared by the states in question. These include, among others, regional preponderance, aspiration to a global role, and the contesting of US hegemony. These characteristics arguably make the group as a whole a useful category in analyzing or in analysis and in policy formulation. However, the term emerging powers may no longer be the most appropriate concept to refer to this group of countries, as they are no longer just seeking to play a global role. They already play a global role. They already contest US hegemony in certain areas, and they have formed poles of power and influence in a multipolar world that continues to unfold. They are thus arguably no longer emerging powers, but southern powers, because the idea here is how long will they be emerging for? So can we call China and India an emerging power when they've actually surpassed some countries that are already within the UN Security Council in terms of their material influence and material power? So let me go on. The concept, or rather, this is because they are no longer emerging powers, but southern powers. It is also important to note that in these shared characteristics, it is irrelevant whether the nation states in question are actively seeking to challenge US hegemony as a matter of purposeful strategy or by default. This is because global power is relative. And as some countries increase their influence in global politics, other countries experienced a diminished influence over others. The concept of southern powers also presupposes that these countries share certain minimal values. These values include a respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of all nations, the abstention from intervention or interference in the internal affairs of another country, the settlement of international disputes through peaceful means and dialogue, and the promotion of mutual interest and cooperation in international affairs. So I just thought, before I dig in, let me just give that brief overview around the very concept of southern powers vis-a-vis the concept of emerging powers, because some of these countries I'm speaking of are already exerting an influence in global affairs. The way that I've structured this presentation is essentially around 4 key points. The first one is on the international development landscape before COVID-19. The second is on COVID-19 and the blurring of the North-South divide. The third is on overcoming a fragmenting multilateral framework towards a strengthened regional cooperation infrastructure, ? And the fourth point is around supporting socioeconomic recovery post-COVID-19. And in all these points, I'll be emphasizing the role of southern powers like China and India. So the international development landscape before COVID-19 was already experiencing a number of changes that were quite evident. We saw a growing number of actors and modalities of cooperation. So if you think back, for instance, around the year 2000 and even just after that, you had essentially countries of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, specifically countries within the Development Assistance Committee, the DAC committee. These countries largely dominated international development cooperation flows and practices. They dominated in terms of the ideas around cooperation. And essentially, more than 80%, 90% of international development cooperation was through countries of the OECD. And that was the landscape that characterized, the development landscape around 2000 and shortly after that. Richard Manning, who was then heading the OECD DEC countries, he emphasized, this point and essentially said that this was a historically unique point, to have such a few countries essentially dominating the discourse around international development, but also dominating the practices of international development cooperation. And what was significant is that in the years that followed that, we saw the landscape changing. We saw countries from the global south increasingly playing important roles in other places, amongst other developing countries. So, to take India and China as an example, in the year 2000, when other countries were, or at least when certain publications were looking at Africa as essentially a lost continent, an underdeveloped continent, characterized with pieces in the Economist, which basically, referred to the continent as the lost, continent. And essentially what happened is at that very time, countries from the global south were actually increasing their role in the world. And they were seeing opportunities in countries which had been written off as lost cases, in other areas. So whereas a lot of people looked at Africa as a place only for development cooperation, countries like China and India were establishing fora, such as the Forum on Africa-China Cooperation, and also the India-Africa Forum Summits. They were increasingly encouraging their businesses to expand and actually move into Africa, into Latin America, and into other parts of Asia. And essentially to internationalize their operations. And they were seeing opportunities in Africa. So remember that these are countries who themselves come from poverty. So if we go back just a few decades, China and India were essentially among the largest recipients of development cooperation. They faced huge challenges within their own countries. And so when they looked at other countries and other regions like Africa, and they understood that, yes, you might have socioeconomic challenges, you might have unemployment rates, you might have all these socioeconomic challenges that these regions face. But they could also see opportunity. They saw opportunity for cooperation. They saw opportunity for boosting their political relations, their political engagement. And they also saw opportunities for their own companies to internationalize and essentially launch operations in those countries. So, when if it's in China, whether it was the Export and Import Bank, which was encouraging Chinese companies to go out, or the China Development Bank, but also in India, such as the Indian Export and Import Bank. We saw a lot of Indian and Chinese enterprises moving into the continent, expanding their cooperation initiatives. So this was the landscape that was essentially evolving prior to the COVID-19 crisis. But also, besides just China and India, we also saw other countries growing their role as sources of development cooperation. Increasingly thinking about the modalities that they could actually utilize to expand their own cooperation. So you saw modalities such as your trilateral cooperation increasingly becoming more important in practice, but also in the discourse of international cooperation. And essentially, with that, you also had a growing number of ideas around development. So in the past, whereas we largely looked to Europe, we looked to the United States for ideas on development, for ideas around the role of the state, the role of the economy, or the role of private sector. We largely looked to European and American thinkers. We looked at their models of development. And what was happening prior to COVID-19 was that was changing. So increasingly, countries of the South were no longer just looking to Europe and the US for ideas on development, but they were increasingly looking at the successful cases also within the global South to understand what they could actually draw from their own experiences. And this is understandable also because some of these countries in the global South also possessed similar conditions to other developing countries. And therefore, it was logical to also understand what you could actually draw on. And I'll just give you a short example. In South Africa, for many years, we've been grappling with the idea of the role of state-owned enterprises, what role they should play in the economy, how they should be run, and so forth. And one of our state-owned enterprise, the South African Airways, it's been going through a number of challenges in recent years. But increasingly, what you find interesting in the discourse is that people are not saying, you know, what can we learn, for instance, from a Lufthansa or from a British Airways or from other airlines in the US. People are looking at an airline like Ethiopian Airways and are saying, what can we learn from how they are actually managing, you know, that state-owned enterprise? And I think that tells you something about the thinking that is evolving within the global South in terms of the very ideas on development. So essentially what you've had was a growing number of actors and a growing number of modalities of cooperation. That was prior to COVID-19. The second point that to emphasize on is how COVID-19 is in some way also leading to a blurring of the North-South divide. To expand on that analogy, I'll just compare, for instance, the development paradigm that was characterized by the Millennium Development Goals vis-a-vis the development paradigm that is actually characterized by ideas around the Sustainable Development Goals. So when the Millennium Development Goals were advocated and when countries were busy implementing them, I think a lot of people put a disproportionate amount of emphasis on countries from the North assisting countries in the South to achieve those development goals. However, what we saw with the Sustainable Development Goals is that it was no longer about a North-South discourse or a donor-recipient discourse. So it was no longer just about countries in the North coming to assist countries in the South to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, but it was essentially highlighting a set of challenges that affected all countries, even if not equally, but they affected all countries. So if we think about it, something like inequality, that's something that is not only affecting countries in the South, but it's also affecting countries in the global North. And the SDGs essentially put also a stronger role for not only North-South cooperation, but also for South-South cooperation. So an example here is in the beginning, when COVID-19 actually broke out, we saw a certain amount of solidarity where countries, obviously at that time, Wuhan was the epicenter. And we saw a number of countries, both within the South and in the North, actually wanting to pledge solidarity to China to actually send whatever it is that they could send. And here I'm not talking about just countries in the North which had resources, but also developing countries. I mean, I remember here, even in South Africa, various organizations sending masks to China, for instance, to assist the country in its COVID-19 response. And then once China managed to actually get it under control, and we saw the epicenters moving now to Europe, what was interesting there is that we also saw now a country like China increasingly extending its assistance into Europe, to Italy, to Spain, and to other countries. Once it also hit the United States, we saw also countries from the South also extending their support to the US, sending equipment and other forms of assistance. And I think what's interesting there is that whereas in the past, development cooperation largely flowed from the North to the South, is what we are seeing now is that increasingly you are getting a development landscape where you're also seeing South-North cooperation, but also where you are seeing South-South cooperation expanding. And there you even look at an example like Cuba, for instance, actually sending medical assistance not only to Europe, but also to other countries in the South, even here to South Africa. You're also seeing, I think, yes, North-South cooperation remains relevant, but also North-to-North cooperation also becomes relevant. So essentially what we're moving into is a landscape where you can no longer just characterize countries as those who have the ability to assist others. Essentially, everyone has something to learn from everybody else. And that's why we're seeing the flows not only from North to South, but also from South to North, South to South, and the other way around. And I think that's creating quite an interesting development landscape, which is questioning the very fixed ideas that we had around this sharp division between the North and the South, as though countries from the North cannot learn anything from countries from the South. So I think this is quite an interesting terrain that we are moving into. However, as that terrain continues to accelerate, a big challenge that we are facing is that of overcoming a fragmenting multilateral framework. And here, for instance, you see the current US policy, for instance, towards the World Health Organization and to other multilateral structures. This is going to present a challenge because even though you are seeing a growing number of actors and modalities of cooperation, and increasingly from the South, within a fragmenting multilateral framework, it becomes more difficult to coordinate international cooperation. And this is going to present challenges. And the question there is whether countries from the South can actually step in and also step up their role within the multilateral framework. Because what is ironic here is that the very countries that created the multilateral order post World War II, some of those countries are themselves beginning to actually retreat from the very multilateral frameworks that they assisted in establishing. And now the question is, as countries from the South grow in their stature and in their influence, can they also expand, or at least can they assist the multilateral order so that it does not continue to fragment? And that's going to be difficult, of course, if you take into account that the largest country in the world is the one which is actually moving away from multilateralism and moving towards a more bilateral form of engagement. So that's going to be a big challenge, I think, in terms of the evolving development landscape. A question there is whether, as the multilateral framework fragments, and here the fragmentation is not just a fragmentation between North and South, it's a fragmentation within the North also. I mean, you look at the transatlantic relations. You look at Brexit. You look at the current U.S. administration and its policies, and you clearly see that you have a fragmentation also within Europe and the U.S. And this is something that for a long time we were not accustomed to. So we were accustomed to the transatlantic partners working cohesively. So the question is, can Southern powers actually step in, working with countries not only in the South, but also countries in the global North, within Europe, who actually still value multilateralism? And can those countries actually assist in actually strengthening the multilateral framework? I suspect what you'll be seeing here is a move towards, possibly towards a strengthened regional cooperation infrastructure, where you may have challenges at the global level, but where particular regions are trying to strengthen, their own mechanisms of cooperation. And an example here is like what African countries have been trying to do even prior to COVID-19, which is to boost intra-continental trade and intercontinental cooperation through avenues like your African Continental Free Trade Area. And this is happening at a very time where other parts of the world are actually fragmenting and are moving in the opposite direction. And I think this idea of building regional cooperation infrastructure is going to be important in terms of actually working as a means of strengthening the multilateral framework. You take, for example, the discussions that are taking place around your supply chains, around your value chains, and if you think that, you know, the type of cooperation frameworks that China and India have. So China is focused now a lot on this idea of the Belt and Road Initiative. So the Belt and Road Initiative, I argue, also presents certain opportunities, let's say, for other developing regions to actually also start to manufacture more within their own regions and to create more regional value chains. And I think this idea is going to become more and more important, especially with what we've seen now with COVID-19. I think China and India are at a unique position in a sense that they, when it comes to medication and so forth, they are largely able to supply, you know, their own societies and produce medication for their own societies. But if you actually move out of those countries, then you realize the level of dependence that is there when it comes to your value chains. And I think what countries, let's say within Africa, will be trying to do is to try to lure Chinese producers to actually produce more within Africa. They will try to also lure Indian producers to produce more within the continent and to create regional value chains. And I think that's going to be obviously quite interesting in terms of seeing how that evolves as we move beyond COVID-19. But it also speaks to some of the priorities of regions like the African continent, because for many years they have been wanting to be more self-sufficient. They have been wanting to produce more within their regions rather than to export raw materials and then import the finished products. So that's going to be much more important within the development landscape, and it's going to be interesting to see whether countries on the continent can actually convince your likes of China and India, but not just China and India, but also other countries, to actually move some of their production within the continent. I mean, you have a growing population, so increasingly you understand that the market is actually, I mean, if producers want to sell to markets within Africa, it increasingly makes sense for them to also move some of their production chains closer to their market. And we know that by 2050, you know, the population on the continent would have doubled. So it's increasingly going to be important to move some of that manufacturing capacity to other regions. The BRI that China has been focusing on is partly going to do that, but there's no guarantee, obviously, that all regions will benefit equally. And there's going to be some level of competition to see who can actually attract Chinese producers into their regions. The same thing with India. When it comes to, for instance, your India-Africa Forum Summit, I think the discourse around there is also going to increasingly be on to what extent can India support the continent in ensuring that it's producing more within the continent rather than actually being an exporter of raw materials. And then I think then the fourth point, you know, on supporting socioeconomic recovery post-COVID-19, there's been a number of pieces and a realization that while the health crisis is a major crisis. But what that crisis will also do in many countries is also trigger an economic crisis. And that economic crisis is even only overshadowed by a broader ecological crisis that some of these regions will be facing after COVID-19. And there the question is, to what extent can countries of the South assist in supporting other developing countries to overcome the socio-economic challenges that have actually been posed by COVID-19? And that will be a big challenge in how countries from the South actually gear their cooperation towards assisting other regions of the global South. We see that there's been a number of reforms, obviously, that have happened in terms of the architecture of cooperation in countries like China and India. I mean, you see in China, they have a new development agency, which they increasingly capacitating. In India, you've also got a number of reforms that have happened to actually arrive at your development partnership administration. And, this plays an important role in terms of how these countries can actually work with other developing countries to gear up for a post-COVID-19 economic and socio-economic recovery. And I think this is going to be the big, test, and that is what is going to actually a huge focus is going to be centered around there. And I do see, obviously, countries like countries within the South continuing to play an increasingly important role when it comes to post-COVID-19 recovery, drawing on lessons within their own countries. And I think us also as scholars, we will increasingly zone in on that. And I think what's going to be interesting is to see what type of mechanisms are countries from the South using to actually expand cooperation. Because while these countries have been questioning some of the practices of the North, they will now be tested to demonstrate that the way in which they are proposing we engage in international cooperation is more progressive, but also leads, to more results. And in that landscape, I think we're going to see much more trilateral cooperation that will also take place, at least amongst countries from the South, because we have to understand that economically everyone will be heavily impacted. So there'll be less resources to actually go around. Countries are already facing debt challenges, and we're already seeing, your Paris club pledging, to say least developed countries should not be forced to actually pay back some of those debts in 2020. China has also joined that declaration, but also India, normally also every few years, we know it normally also scraps some of the debt that least developed countries are actually facing. So the test will really be on how these countries from the South are able to use their own capacities to build capacities in the global South. And I think, I could continue in expanding on some of these areas, but I think those are really the four major issues that, we are being confronted with. That the development landscape, some of the changes we were seeing prior to COVID-19 are being accelerated by COVID-19. So the crisis of multilateralism, it's being accelerated. The growing number of actors, it's being accelerated. The importance of South-South cooperation is even being heightened more. The blurring of the North-South divide, that's going to be an important characteristics within the post-COVID development landscape. And the challenge of overcoming this fragmenting multilateral framework and supporting socioeconomic recovery post-COVID-19. Let me leave it there. And if there are any comments or questions, I'll be happy to take them.
Thank you, Dr. Philani, for your insightful presentation. So yes, I have seen that they are all encouraged and they have started to write down their questions. So maybe we can take their questions and then we'll sum up the lecture. So we are having here a question from Brahmanand Charma. I hope that I'm pronouncing your name well. He is asking about the quality of education in terms of teaching school kids, how it is going to, will it justify their 1 year as online mode seems less efficient? I think it is out of focus, this question. It is not included in our topic. So let's move to Sanskrita. Sanskrita is asking about first, how do you think COVID-19 pandemic has affected South Africa socio-economically?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is one first question of her. Keeping in mind increasing Chinese investment in Africa, how development in the African economic development on these investments, and is there a need to diversify the investments, foreign direct investment in Africa? So she's having good questions. She's also asking, what do you think would be the role of Africa in general in terms of boosting the notion of South Africa, of Global South? Yeah, so this is one first question of Sanskrita. Do you like to answer one by one, or I tell you the...
Yeah, I'll take the first batch that you've just given me. I think I'll start with so there was that question around education, around the quality of education and so forth. I mean, I think, all these countries are in a sense facing this this challenge of trying to rescue the academic year, trying to move towards online education. But I think what this crisis has also shown us is the fact that, yes, for certain challenges, technology does present a tool that you can use to actually address these challenges. But at the same time, if the level of penetration of some of these technologies is not very comprehensive, and if you've got a big digital divide, then it actually exposes the limitations of what you can actually use for technology driven solutions, whether it's in education, whether it's in the future of work. I mean, some people have the privilege of working from home, but not all sectors can actually do that. And also not everyone, depending on the type of infrastructure, can actually do that. So, I mean, education is one of the important things within the SDGs. And I think as we move towards 2030, it's going to be important to discuss education, but also to discuss it alongside the idea of the extent to which technology is actually penetrating into some of the most needy areas, essentially. I mean, you cannot do online learning if you do not have access to a laptop or a smart device, or if the network in your area is very poor. So these are some of the challenges that we're actually grappling with in terms of dealing with the quality of education. In terms of South Africa and the impact of COVID-19, I think it's an interesting question in a sense that South Africa, I think in the initial stages of responding to COVID-19, we've actually had quite a comprehensive, quite a decisive lockdown. I mean, it's being termed one of the strictest lockdowns in the world. Like other developing countries, you obviously have challenges in enforcing this lockdown, particularly in areas where it is actually physically difficult to socially to do social distancing. So it's been an approach which has been led obviously by scientific input. So there's been a committee that has been put in place, led by Professor Karim, who has actually worked closely, with the Minister of Health within South Africa. And I think one of the fortunate things we have here is that our Minister of Health is actually a medical doctor. And dealing with pandemics and epidemics is not something that is out of his depths. And it means that if you have somebody who actually is a trained medical doctor, I think they will be more attentive of the expert advice that is actually coming from the medical profession. Now, initially you had a consensus within the country, and all political parties, fell behind and said, listen, this is the right approach. But what we're witnessing is that about 50 or odd, days into the lockdown, is that some of the opposition parties are increasingly growing restless. So they're questioning some of the regulations around the lockdown, but at the same time also calling for a faster reopening of the lockdown. And I think that's also, in a way, as some of these opposition parties try to remain relevant even under lockdown. But it's certainly having an impact on the contestation around when to actually open up the economy. So while closing down and enforcing a lockdown, there was consensus. We're seeing some of that consensus unraveling when it comes to the level of opening up the economy and contesting some of the regulations. But I still think, generally speaking, our response in South Africa has so far been positive. I mean, we're sitting on roughly above 12,000 cases now, plus minus 200 deaths. But I think the lockdown has also allowed the different provinces, particularly the densely populated areas, to actually boost up their health capacities. So to expand the number of beds that are available. So far in South Africa, we're not seeing a case like what's been happening what happened in Italy, in Spain, and in some parts of the US, where the hospitals became overwhelmed. And I think that's been quite important, because we understood in South Africa that we don't want to get to a point where the healthcare system is actually overwhelmed. But obviously that has an impact on the socioeconomic issues. People are losing their jobs, people are struggling to make an income, and that discussion is an ongoing one in South Africa. But I think what's also important in the South African case is what I said earlier about the development landscape. We can learn from each other. It's not just about saying we can only learn from Europe and the US. So for instance, a country like South Africa, which prior to COVID-19 essentially had the largest state-led program in the fight against HIV and AIDS. The country has been able to draw from that experience. It's been able to draw from that infrastructure. So it's been able to also send, for instance, thousands of social workers, of health workers into vulnerable communities to do screening, to do testing. But we could only do that because of the infrastructure that was built up prior to COVID-19 in terms of fighting another health crisis presented by HIV and AIDS. And we've been able to use some of the lessons there and apply them to COVID-19. So that's been quite interesting. And I think it's also interesting at a broader continental level, in a sense that, you know, some people have been almost putting it as an inevitability that Africa will be the next epicenter for COVID-19. And I'm not too sure whether we can just confidently say that, because I think, you know, countries on the continent, despite the lack of resources, material resources that they actually have, but they have a lot of experience in actually fighting epidemics. They've got recent experiences, you know, whether it's HIV/AIDS, whether it's with regards to the Ebola outbreak, and other, you know, health challenges on the continent. So a lot of these countries actually, you know, closed their borders relatively early and shut their doors to travel. So the rates of infection on the continent, while they are increasing, but they're certainly not to the levels that we've been seeing in Europe, or particularly in Western Europe and in the US. And I think the biggest challenge on the continent might not be the health crisis that's presented by COVID-19. It will be the socioeconomic challenges that countries face as a result of COVID-19. So for the last, 10 years or so, consistently, at least 7 out of the fastest growing economies in the world have been economies in Africa. And with essentially a global lockdown in place, that's having a huge impact on those countries' economic growth and on their development trajectories. Countries that are big oil exporters. I mean, the collapse of the oil price is having huge impacts on some of those countries' projections and their ability to actually raise capital to reinvest into their development projects. So in Africa, I think the big challenge is around the socioeconomic challenges that are presented by COVID-19. And with regards to the question on China in Africa, and this idea of diversifying foreign direct investment. I think this is an important point because, you know, African countries they don't have the luxury to choose between China or the US, or to choose between you know, Germany or others. African countries are essentially looking to widen their basket as much as possible, and not to be dependent on any one particular actor. And I think it's important to understand that to a certain extent, on the African continent, countries like China and India, on a certain level, are actually playing catch up, particularly in the area of foreign direct investment. I mean, European countries obviously still exert a big influence in Africa. So if you look even at the budget of the African Union, you know, I'm always intrigued to watch the type of stories that came out when China built the African Union's headquarters as part of their development projects on the continent. And immediately, you know, certain papers were coming out and saying, is this a new form of colonialism, and so on and so forth. And I found that quite intriguing because, you know, the same people who were maybe saying that were not necessarily questioning that European countries are still responsible for a huge chunk of the African Union's budget. Whether it's in peace and security, whether it's in the operational costs, but they're also still responsible for a huge proportion of the budgets of the regional economic communities on the continent. So actually, for Africa, engagement with China and India and other countries, whether it's Turkey, South Korea, Japan, Indonesia, and all these other countries, from an African country perspective, that is part of the diversification strategy. Because for too many years, a lot of African countries were overly dependent on their cooperation with the West. And that obviously has a historical reason. And in that sense, a lot of countries are seeing China, India, and other countries as part of their diversification strategy. And then lastly, the question on the role of Africa. I think, you know, Africa essentially will play still quite a significant role because of some of the trends that we're witnessing on the continent. We know that the population will double in the next few decades. We know that that's going to have a huge impact, you know, on the development trajectory of the continent. But at the same time, the bloc of African countries within the UN General Assembly still plays an important role as essentially the largest voting bloc. So what some of the work that we've been doing around, you know, Africa's place in the world is that the continent needs to find a way of ensuring that they are able to work in a more cohesive and in a more strategic manner in engaging with external powers in order to enhance, you know, our own negotiating position. Now, that doesn't throw away the importance of bilateral relations. You know, that will still remain. But I think around certain strategic areas, it's important to see more cohesiveness within the continent, where the continent is able to work more, as a more cohesive actor in international relations, and where countries and sub-regions are beginning to actually coordinate more. Now, there were some positive moves in the past few years. We've seen that the regional economic communities are coordinating more with the African Union in order to bring about, more cohesiveness to Africa's engagement. So even when you look at Agenda 2063, which is, the vision that Africa has put out there, is one of the areas that are being looked at, is around how Africa needs to do a lot more work in terms of the domestic mobilization of resources, so that the continent is less dependent on let's say on donor recipient relations, for their own development challenges. It needs to tackle issues such as illicit financial flows. I mean, if you look, a lot of people imagine that Africa is a net recipient of aid. But actually, if you look at the financial flows of the continent, it's quite clear that the continent is actually subsidizing certain parts of the world. So there's more money flowing out of the continent than money actually coming into the continent. And a lot of those flows are through illicit financial flows. And if the continent is able to stem some of that, and some of that can actually be used more towards Africa's own development goals. And I think in that way, if the continent can act more cohesively and more strategically, then rather than focusing on issues around national sovereignty, then increasingly we will be focusing on issues around continental sovereignty and strategic autonomy of the continent. And I think that's really the idea moving forward. But obviously that's a challenge because, you've got over 50 countries, all with their own different dynamics. But I think it still remains a strategic imperative for the continent to push for more strategic engagement and thereby enhance its agency in international relations.
Yeah, we are having 3 more interesting questions. First one is from Ashima, our guest Ashima Singh. The question is about what are the challenges the pandemic is having in achieving the sustainable effects of the pandemic in achieving sustainable development goals. We are having also one more question from our intern Aru Bharadwaj. He's from Punjab University. He's asking about giving that sluggish global trade due to the hit of COVID-19. How would the WTO, what is going to be the role of WTO is going to play in order to promote international trade in this specific time? And the third question is from our Egyptian intern, Mohammed Bidawi. He's asking about the new development collaboration that you think it will be created after COVID-19 pandemic between Middle Eastern countries and Southern countries. Is he now specifying Middle East with the in its situation in the global South?
Good.
So there's 3 more interesting questions.
Sure. No, perfect. I think challenges in achieving the SDGs. There's no doubt that COVID-19 is going to it is already negatively impacting the ability of countries to actually achieve the SDGs. But at the same time, it's also highlighting some of the very challenges that are highlighted within the SDGs. So SDGs, will focus on issues around even inequality. And if COVID-19 has really brought to the surface some of those challenges of inequality, not only in countries of not only in developing countries, but also in the global north. And I think, the challenge is going to be around how can we use the crisis to actually try to expand our ability to cooperate in achieving the SDGs after this crisis, because it's something that we have to now live with. I mean, already the most optimistic people say you'll have a vaccine by the end of the year. And others are saying, no, we might just have to learn to live with this virus. So essentially, a lot of the planning that was done by countries across the world is actually, it's being impacted. So countries are going to be taking some of the development cooperation funds that they would have used to assist other countries to fight their challenges, and are going to redirect those towards their own domestic challenges. So the question is, in that development landscape, what new money will be coming out? What new pledges will actually be coming out? Of course, we know that health is now going to be even brought, higher up the priority list. So, there might be actually even a benefit for health. I mean, certainly health budgets around the world are on the increase. But at the same time, it's about, can we sustain that, over the longer term period? But certainly, the SDGs, some of the SDGs are going to be increasingly difficult to actually achieve, especially given the depth of the economic and social crisis that has actually been presented by COVID-19. I think when it comes to the sluggish global trade and the role of the WTO, I mean, the WTO was already facing a crisis prior to COVID-19, especially when it comes to the dispute resolution mechanism. It's no secret that the US administration did not really have, a high regard for how the WTO functions and how the multilateral order functions. So essentially, what the US has been trying to do is to drive a wedge also between some of the countries from the global south, just in terms of how they even define themselves as developing countries within the WTO. We saw when somebody like Bolsonaro came into power in Brazil, he immediately said that Brazil will relinquish its developing country status within the WTO. And essentially the US is pushing, that further. They want developing countries like China and India to redefine themselves within the WTO. And I think we've got a real challenge within the WTO. Increasingly, we're seeing trade taking place outside of the mechanisms of the WTO. And if anything, that's actually happened due to COVID-19, It's that increasingly countries are looking at these value chains. So if you look at the rhetoric and you follow the rhetoric in the US, they increasingly saying they want to bring back manufacturing back to the United States. And this has been something that the Trump administration has been actively promoting. Now, the realities in actually implementing that is another thing. But certainly, you know, it goes back to a point I alluded to earlier around this creation of regional value chains. I do think that there is a need to rethink the whole value chain system, and to understand that even though there was no, even though China could essentially supply much of this equipment to the rest of the world prior to COVID-19, but it presents a huge challenge when a country like China is faced, with this challenge. And if you had regional value chains, I think you would strengthen the ability of countries to actually to get the right equipment to certain countries, rather than being overly dependent on any one region of the world or any one country. Now, we know that China is already moving beyond to its next stage in terms of its development plans. So China is already moving towards actually trying to encourage more domestic consumption. It's moving away from this model of being a cheap producer of the world's products. In fact, China has been actually encouraging some of its factories to actually relocate outside of China and to relocate towards countries along the Belt and Road. And I think in that sense, it does create opportunities to actually diversify the value chains, and for regions which have traditionally not been manufacturing to take some of this excess capacity that we've seen in countries like China. And for Africa, that's important because we have a lot of natural resources. And if we could produce the goods within our own regions with the assistance of China and India and even countries in the north, that would be essential for Africa's growth trajectory, but also for our development goals. Because if we are going to be doubling the African population in the next few decades, we need to create jobs here on the continent. And we're going to create jobs here if we are producing more of the products here on the continent, rather than simply shipping of our raw materials. So again, that's an area where the WTO has come under increasing stress, and I think it's looking to be one of the serious casualties of a post-COVID-19 landscape, especially if Trump gets re-elected later this year. I think if Trump gets re-elected later this year, then the WTO is definitely going to be a casualty. It's going to play a lesser role in terms of as a mechanism for countries to actually dispute certain trade-related issues, and that's going to exacerbate the fragmentation in the global trade system. And then lastly, just around the question of the Middle Eastern countries. Well, these countries have also been one of the important actors when it comes to a changing development landscape prior to COVID-19. If you look at their growing interests in Africa, in the Horn of Africa, in the Sahel, in North Africa, but even further south. I think these countries, prior to COVID-19, they had deeper pockets. They had, significant reserves that they could actually rely on. And these countries were increasingly playing a role as sources of development cooperation on the continent. And of course, some of these countries are now heavily impacted by a sharp fall in the oil prices. So this might have an impact, post COVID-19 in terms of their ability to ramp up their role as sources of development cooperation. But I think it's also going to highlight for them, I mean, a lot of them already had strategies of diversifying beyond oil. But what this will do is further highlight the importance of them actually diversifying. But I think they're going to continue to play a strong role, particularly on the African continent, especially around the Horn of Africa, the Sahel, and also in North Africa.
Our question is from our intern, Disha Mishra. She's asking about, can you shed some light on how the COVID-19 impacted China's Belt and Road Initiative in Africa?
Okay. I think, one thing I found interesting around the Belt and Road Initiative, and this was even prior to COVID-19, is that increasingly there was the second Belt and Road Initiative Forum that took place in Beijing. And if you look at what President Xi was actually saying, he was highlighting that China will no longer fund what was called, or what some have called, vanity projects, whether it's building a stadium or whether it's building, so it's China itself is focusing much more on the quality now of the projects that they are actually funding, and it means that increasingly on the continent there will be a competition, I think, for Chinese Belt and Road Initiative projects. If you look at what China has been doing in terms of almost removing some of its excess production capacity to other countries along the Belt and Road. I mentioned earlier that certain factories in China, which were regarded as contributing a lot to pollution and so forth, have basically been encouraged to close down and to take their production outside of the country. Now, of course, you cannot replicate the Chinese model, and you cannot replicate some of the Chinese factories the way they operated in China in other countries. But there's definitely going to be competition along the Belt and Road to actually attract Chinese companies to come and produce in their own territories, rather than just producing in China. But it's going to be a tight competition, because I mean, East Asian countries will want a piece of the pie. Central Asian countries will also be wanting a piece of the pie. And I think the countries on the continent that stand a chance to actually attract more Chinese activities are countries along the Indian Ocean, along that coast. You know, I think those are the countries that actually stand a chance of attracting more production in their own territories. But you know, going back to what President Xi said, it's very clear that Chinese banks are going to become more cautious around the type of projects that they're actually financing on the African continent. Because, you know, where some might talk about debt diplomacy and all of that, but I can guarantee you that, you know, when lenders lend money, they expect to get returns from that. And it is not in their interests for countries in Africa to be defaulting. And in that sense, they are going to become more stricter in scrutinizing, you know, the type of projects that are actually taking place. They're going to become stricter in looking at, you know, issues around corruption and so forth, because at the end of the day, it also becomes, it's in their interest to actually look into some of those issues. So, you know, I think certain countries, I mean, so many countries have signed up to the Belt and Road Initiative, but it's very clear that not all countries will benefit equally. The countries that are better prepared, that have stronger engagement with China, countries that are able to actually present bankable projects to China, those are the countries that are going to benefit more from the Belt and Road Initiative. And others will unfortunately not benefit as much.
We had one last question from Mr. Fernando. He was raising his hand. So, Mr. Fernando, do you have a question to ask to Dr. Philani?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, hi, Dr. Philani. Yes. My question was about the tourism sector, especially in the southern part. So to revive the economy and the tourism sector, do you have any insights or something? And I mean, it was a wonderful presentation by you, firstly. Yeah. So
Thank you.
Would you share some thoughts, especially countries that are affected by this COVID, which are grappling with the tourism sector being really slow. So what do you say?
I think in the, you know, it's a very important question in a sense that tourism is a very important employer. And especially, you know, countries in the south, countries that had been seeing their tourism numbers going up, and also countries that had been, I mean, if you think about it, if you think about international travel prior to COVID-19, the airlines were recording, you know, the biggest numbers of international travel. Companies like Boeing were actually expecting more and more orders of their machinery. There were new designs of certain aircraft, you know, which were bigger, more comfortable and all of that. And if you think what's happened just to that industry, and that effectively travel has basically ground to a halt. A lot of the airlines are operating with, you know, seeing less than, or at least around 95% drop in their numbers. I mean, this is going to have a huge knock-on effect. It's having a huge knock-on effect on the tourism industry. So I think what's increasingly going to be important is already what countries have been trying to promote, which is not only international tourism, but also domestic tourism. So South Africa, for instance, was already trying to promote more domestic tourism, even prior to COVID-19. And I think that is going to become even more important now, because the numbers are certainly not going to get back to pre-COVID-19 quickly. So the countries are going to have to obviously promote that domestic tourism, but they're also going to have to understand that the numbers are definitely not going to recover to the levels which they were prior to COVID-19 anytime soon. And even as they start recovering, they're going to essentially have to adapt to living within a COVID-19 landscape. So they're going to have to convince, the tourists that what they have on offer also meets the certain health conditions. And it's one of those sectors which are one of the hardest hit, by COVID-19. And as I said, it's not going to recover to where it was immediately. But I think countries are going to have to tap into their domestic tourism market. And if you, a huge country like China and a huge country like India can certainly, try to promote domestic consumption. But there are other countries which unfortunately were more dependent on international tourism than domestic tourism. And those countries are unfortunately going to be the hardest hit.
Oh, yeah. So regional tourism is one area that can expand in the coming years.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, if you think about regional tourism, right? If Africa is able to prevent the worst of the health crisis presented by COVID-19, then a country like South Africa has got to be able to tap into the regional pool of tourism, right? Because and the continental, right? Because now you whereas in the past we were, we looked at Europe, we looked at the US, we looked at Asia. We're going to have to tap into that regional pool. And it goes back to that number on intra-regional trade.
Yeah.
The continent is still way below where it needs to be. I mean, we're still at around less than 20% of our trade is intra-regional. And if we can increase that, then that will be one way of not replacing, tourists from other parts of the world, but it will be one way of creating a buffer in a way.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so thank you, Mr. Fernando, for your question. Okay, so I see that we do not have any other question in the chat box. May I ask you please to close your, so I can see Dr. Philani? Yeah, so thank you, Dr. Philani Mthembu, for your enlightening and insightful presentation for today on international development cooperation and international development finance and all the challenges that this global concern is facing after COVID-19, and how is going to be the new role of global southern countries, and your special insights on the role of India and China. So we in Jindal Center for Global South, we really owe you a vote of thanks for accepting our invitation for our today's webinar. So we really appreciate your acceptance for our invitation, and we look forward for more collaboration in the future. And I would like also to thank all our attendees and their very special questions that they have asked, and this interactions that we had at the end of your presentation. So we are really thankful for all of you, and thank you, Professor Philani, for accepting our invitation again. So we look forward